Welcome to the Daoism experience. My name is Solala Towler, and I've been studying the principles, the practices, the philosophy of Daoism for about 25 years now. During this course, we will introduce you to the 9 basic concepts of Taoist thought, as well as some of the Taoist practices, such as meditation, Daoyin, which is a form of Taoist yoga, and Qigong. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the most famous text of Taoism, the one that many people know about, which is the Daodejing, which was written 2,500 years ago by a man named Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is actually not his name, but a title. Lao Tzu means like old teacher, old master. Interestingly enough, the term Zi, which is a character like a 3 with a line through it, also can mean master, also means child. Lao means old. So sometimes you'll see Lao Tzu, the name translated as old boy or old child. And just like in the Bible where Jesus talks about becoming as a child to enter the kingdom of heaven, Lao Tzu also talks about becoming as a child to enter Tao. The very first line of Daodejing says, Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, which means the Tao that can be spoken or put into words or defined and put into a little box is not the true and eternal Tao. So right away in the very beginning of the book, he's saying that words cannot truly express what Tao is. In chapter 25, Daodejing, he says, there was something found. In chapter 25 of Daodejing, he says, there was something formed in chaos, coming before heaven and earth, existing in the silent and tranquil void. It stands alone and unchanging. It pervades everywhere without becoming exhausted. It is the mother of heaven and earth. I do not know its name, and so call it Tao. Now the word Tao is made up of 2 parts, one for head, one for road. So Tao is usually translated as way or path. It is a path or way to follow for us to return back to Tao, what the Taoists call attaining Tao or returning to the source. Tao is a word that has been translated in many different ways. Tao means something like the all that is, the universal truth. Tao is not a person. Taoism, in basic classical Taoism, we don't have an idea of a personalized Godhead. Tao, rather than a being, is more of a state of being. Tao is where everything comes from, where everything returns to. In Taoist spiritual practice called self-cultivation, what we're doing is trying to become healthy and clear and wise enough so that we can transcend the world of duality to back to the original oneness, which we call Tao. Lao Tzu wrote this book. The story is very interesting how he wrote the book. He was quite a high official in the Zhou dynasty, and he worked in the royal archives. He had studied many texts. He had students. He was a very wise man. And at that time in the Zhou dynasty, we were heading into what's called the Warring States period, where a lot of the different kingdoms that made up China were vying for power and fighting each other. And there was a lot of chaos, a lot like our world today. And Lao Tzu decided, rather than stay in that world, he was going to leave and go west to the wilderness, to the mountains. Taoists have always traveled to the mountains for their spiritual cultivation. As a matter of fact, one of the terms for a sage or enlightened person is Shenren. Shen is combining the words for person and mountain. A mountain person is who the sage is. So Lao Tzu was on his way. He was in an ox cart, he was traveling west, and he got to a certain gateway of the last frontier at Logontai. Fortunately, the person who was in charge of that gateway knew of Lao Tzu, and so he welcomed him in. As a matter of fact, the story goes that a few days before that, Yan Xin, who was the fellow's name, saw a purple cloud coming his way. And so he knew that a very high being would soon be arriving. So he welcomed Lao Tzu down from his ox cart and brought him in and gave him tea, gave him food, And Lao Tzu said, I'm just spending one night here, and then tomorrow I leave for the frontier, for the wilderness. And so Yin Xin begged Lao Tzu to write something of his teachings down, because Lao Tzu had not written anything before. In those days, most of knowledge was passed on orally, like in many ancient cultures, including Vedas, some of the Buddhist sutras. And so they weren't written down because people fear that once something is written down, it loses some of its power. When you can share something orally through a chant or a story, there's a power that goes that you're able to transmit directly to the person listening. But if it's someone who never met you, who possibly lives in another age, is just listening or reading the words that are written, some of that transmission is lost. But Yin Xin prevailed, and Lao Tzu stayed up that first night, and he wrote a very short book, only 5,000 characters, 81 chapters, very short, succinct chapters. And in this book, he offered his whole philosophy, all his knowledge, everything that he had learned from his teachers, from his studying with the Wu shamans, studying with the farmers, with the scholars, with the military men. He put all that knowledge into this very small book that we are still studying today, 2,500 years later. The interesting thing about Daodejing is that it can be translated different ways. There are many so-called translations of this book out there now that are really depart so significantly from the original text that they really have barely anything to do with Lao Tzu's work. A lot of times people just have their own ideas. They put the title Daodejing on it, and then they just talk about their own ideas. And personally, I find that there is so much wisdom to be gleaned from this short book of Lao Tzu's that to try to stay with the most authentic translation as possible is really the best way to go. Lao Tzu, of course, is not the only Taoist teacher. A next generation after him is Zhuangzi, who is also very famous, very, very important. We'll be sharing some of his words during this course as well as another fellow named Lao Tzu. I'd like to start also by saying there's a lot of confusion about how to pronounce these Chinese words, how to spell these Chinese words. You will see on the title to this course and in many books the word Dao spelled with a T, even though it's pronounced with a D, which can be very confusing for people who are not familiar with this material. This is because the old system of transliterating Chinese characters into English letters, called the Wei-Jile system, for some reason decided that everything pronounced with a D would be spelled with a T. Nowadays in China and for many scholars in the West, we use a system called the Pinyin System, and in that system, Dao is spelled with a D. You will also see Lao Tzu spelled L-A-O and then T-Z-U, pronounced Lao Tzu. In the Pinyin system, it is spelled L-A-O-Z-I. Makes it a little easier to understand. There's a practice that many people do in the West called Taiji or Taiji Chuan. It is spelled T-A-I-C-H-I. So of course, most people in the West who practice and even teach this practice call it Tai Chi, when actually it is pronounced Taiji and spelled in the modern Pinyin system as T-A-I-J-I, Taiji. Just a little idea for when you're trying to, if you study some of this on your own, some of the words I'm saying or the way I'm pronouncing them may be unfamiliar to you, and I think it's nice to be able to pronounce things the way they're supposed to be pronounced. That's just me. So the way that Lao Tzu's book is pronounced as Daodejing. And Daodejing means Dao, which we've already talked about. De is another very important word, principle in Daoism. De, spelled T-E, pronounced D-E, means sometimes as often mistranslated as virtue. And it really doesn't mean virtue in a moralistic sense, in a Confucian sense. De really means something like spiritual power. De also is the idea that Tao made manifest in the world, that is De. So it means how we can see Tao in the world, how its workings, how its manifestations come about in the world is the De. Also spiritual power. High masters, from whatever culture they come from, you feel there's a power that they have. And in Daoism we call that De. Jing means classic or classic book. So Daodejing is the book, the classical book of Dao and De. So I think it's very interesting that the first line of the entire book is telling us what we can put into words can never actually, is only an approximation, can never actually describe the totality of the universe, of the multiverse, of what Tao really means. Taoists use 9 basic principles in our self-cultivation practice, and we're going to be going over all of those. The 9 basic principles are Wu Wei, which is not forcing, the watercourse way, going with the flow, Pu, which means being natural, the value of worthlessness, the wisdom of foolishness, flexibility, Yin Yang, going slowly, and the way of tea, or Cha Dao. We'll actually be doing a little Kung Fu tea ceremony later on in this course. But for now, I wanted you to just get a sense of some of the terms, some of the principles we use in Daoism. Daoism is very much aligned with nature, with the cycles of the seasons, outside of us and also within us. And it is by attuning ourselves to becoming sensitive to those cycles, to those seasons within our own being, that we are able to find harmony and balance. And in this way, we are able to find a way through the challenges that life brings us. We all have challenges in our life. No one escapes challenges. Even the people who travel to the mountains and live in a cave, or travel to monasteries and live in monasteries, there all are problems that we come into in life. And it is how we respond to these problems, to these challenges. This is what constitutes our spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is not just when we're meditating, when we're doing Qigong. It is also how we live our life, moment to moment, each moment unfolding, unfurling into the next moment. So being natural. An enlightened being in Daoism we call Zhen Ren, which means self-realized. Sometimes this term is also mistranslated as the perfect man or the perfect woman. Zhen Ren means the self-realized or self-actualized being. People who find a way to really experience themselves as being more than just what we are in our little shell of our human body. One of the other chapters in Daodejing, which is also mistranslated usually as if we didn't have a body, we wouldn't have any problems. And while that may be true in a lot of ways, the actual way to translate that line is, if we didn't have a limited sense of self, we wouldn't have problems. Most of us are born and live and die in a world of dualism. God is something out there in another state. We are lowly people here. We are just stuck in these bodies. There's no way out of these bodies. And so people find a way to take themselves out of their bodies, often through drugs, alcohol, self-abuse, sexual abuse, watching too much television, all these things that take us out of where we really need to be, to stay, to develop, to cultivate, to become spiritual beings, to become Zhen Ren, to transcend this world of duality. When we talk about Yin Yang, we'll talk about this a little more. And when we talk about some of these other principles, we'll be able to show you a little more about how Taoist people manage to do this practice. We call it self-cultivation because Just like a garden, we plant the garden, we plant the seeds, we water the garden, we tend the garden. We try to pull out any of the weeds that get in the way of this seed growing up into these beautiful plants. The seeds that we plant in our spiritual being eventually grow and become beautiful trees, become beautiful bushes, fruit. We are able to enjoy it. This is our self-cultivation. This is how we become spiritual beings. This is how we use these principles as well as the practices, the very basic practices of Daoism, to transcend this world of dualism, to get out of our little shell, to not distract ourselves with things that just waste our chi, that instead find a way to go within and find a way to respond to the challenges of life in a way that they become medicine. The Tibetan Buddhists are very good about looking at problems. They call them medicine. And Taoists also, the challenges that we face in life become the medicine, become the seeds that we plant in our gardens. We are able to grow and flourish. Another wonderful thing about Taoist practices is you don't have to become a Taoist to do Qigong or Tai Chi or meditation. Nowadays there are two main streams of Taoism, one called Daojia, one called Daozhou. Daojia is more of the classical Taoism of Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Lai Tzu, and Lao Tzu himself was not a Taoist. He was a wise teacher, a sage, an enlightened being. He uses the term Tao, but he never uses the term Taoist. Zhuangzi either, or Lai Tzu either. It was only later, in about 142 CE, that a man named Zhang Daoling founded the first Taoist religious movement. And this is what we call Daozhou. And while Daozhou uses a lot, of course, of the classical teachings of Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, it also brings in a lot of other kinds of practices. It has a priesthood, monks, nuns, a lot of precepts, a lot of rules, does a lot of rituals, very rich world of Daozhou. Most people in the West, I have found, are not as interested or not able to go too deeply into Daozhou. I have a few friends who are priests in various sects of Taoism, and they've had to learn a lot of ritual and memorize a lot of scripts, and they have a very rich life that way. For what I practice and what many people in the West practice, we would call Daojia, or we would just call classical Taoism. And there is, of course, a lot of intermingling of these, so it's not just one end of things and one other end of things. But especially if you don't want to become a Taoist and join the Taoist religion, you can certainly do Qigong, Tai Chi, Daoyin, meditation. Apply these principles of Wu Wei, watercourse way, to your life. That's the richness of Taoism, I feel. So no matter what spiritual path or religion or nationality you are, you can use these principles and practices that we will be teaching in this course to help yourself live a richer, fuller life and to perhaps attain some kind of spiritual enlightenment. Now I'd like to share a few words with you about what a sage is and is not. This is from an ancient book, Zhuangzi, which after the Daodejing is the most important of the ancient Taoist classics. But what is a sage? The ancient masters did not mind poverty. They took no pride in their achievements. They made no plans. They could commit an error and not regret it. They could succeed without being proud. They could climb mountains without fear, enter water without getting wet, and pass through fire without getting burnt. This is truly a person who is at one with Tao. The ancient sages slept without dreaming and awoke without anxiety. Their food was not fancy and their breathing was deep. The breath of a sage rises from the heels, while the breath of the common person comes only from the throat. These people, when they become upset, find their breath catches in their throat. Caught up in the world of desires and lusts, they lose the way of heaven and their nature becomes shallow. The ancient sages were not attached to life, nor did they fear death. To them, being born was nothing special, nor was death. Carefree they came into this world, and carefree they went out of it. They did not worry too much about where they came from, nor did they worry about where they were going. They accepted whatever they were given with joy and gratitude, but often gave it away in turn. They did not use their mind to resist the Tao and did not try to divine the ways of heaven. This is what I call a true sage. With this kind of person, their mind is free, their spirit is calm, and their brow is smooth. They are as cool as autumn, yet as warm as spring. Their joy and anger happen naturally, like the four seasons. They are at harmony with all things and experience themselves as having no limitations. And then, as to what a sage is not, someone who has a desire to have all knowledge is not a sage. The sage does not show partiality. The one who follows the timing of society is not a sage. The one who is above both loss and gain can be called a sage. But the one who seeks recognition and fame instead of following his own inner wisdom is not a sage. He who does not live his life guided by his own authentic nature is not a sage. This was the true sage of old. This was the true sage of old. He kept himself apart from the world, standing straight and firm without wavering. He was humble, yet not servile. He was independent, yet not stubborn. He was open to all things and did not boast. He always smiled, as if pleased with the world, responding to changes naturally. His radiance came from his inner light. He remained centered within himself, even in the company of others. He was quick to agree with others, yet was centered in himself so that he was not easily influenced by others. He held himself a little apart from the world and sometimes seemed absent-minded, as if he were not sure what to say. He was unified in his being. What he unified with was the One. What he was not unified with was also the One. That which is one is one.